Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, so I'm Mark Parsons. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to see so many people here. So I'm the Secretary General for the Research Data Alliance. So I'm going to talk about the Research Data Alliance, but I want to put some context around that. We heard from our opener that we are interested in open data, which leads to open science, and I'm a strong advocate of open data. But as you can see from the title of my talk, I'm arguing that that's insufficient. Open data is only a first step. Making the data available is only a first step. There's much more that's involved with that. And I thought a good way to maybe describe this is just to start with a story from my experience. So I used to work for the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and one of our primary products was sea ice extent. So the extent of frozen ocean water in both polar regions, but the Arctic is particularly interesting. And if you see from this video that September 2012 shattered all records of minimum extent of Arctic sea ice. So this magenta line here, that's the median extent over a 30-year period from 1979. And then cycling there on the right are minimums of every year from 1979 into the present, except for this year, which was the fourth lowest. And you can see that 2012 was, radically lower. And this came on the heels of a previous record-breaking year in 2007, and it brought a lot of attention to my data center. We had an article. There was an article on the front page of the New York Times. The former Vice President Al Gore came to visit us to learn more about the subject. It was a big deal. It got us a lot of attention. So, but my point with this, maybe I'll cycle through that again, is that the data behind this, have been open since the 1980s. But the data that underpin this, is from satellite remote sensing of passive microwave that naturally emits from the planet. And passive microwave is useful for Arctic research because it can see, if you will, in the dark. And the Arctic is, of course, dark half the year. And it can see, if you will, through clouds. And the Arctic is a cloudy place. But when passive microwave sensors were first developed by the Department of Defense, it was for operational weather forecasting. Nobody was thinking about sea ice. But then researchers started to develop some algorithms where they could do differences between the different bands in the passive microwave and start to detect ice and snow. And so there were a series of competing algorithms that were used to present as sea ice. And so there's several things I want to point out as that went into this going from an operational weather forecasting satellite to a long-term climate record of sea ice. So the first, as I mentioned, is algorithms. And so these algorithms were developed by the research community, but there were competing algorithms. There were several of them. And at the data center, we were always asked, which product is best? And the answer, of course, was, well, it depends. What is your application? And that's not a very satisfying answer, usually. I mean, people want to say, oh, this one's best. And there was actually some competition, if you will, between the researchers on their different algorithms. And they had each algorithm had its pros and cons, its applications in certain areas that were better. But there was, it's sort of the politics of science there in terms of the competition of those algorithms. And it took a while before the data center could act as sort of an honest broker to say, use this algorithm for this application, use this algorithm for this application. But it took a while to build that trust within the community, within the research community, that we weren't picking a winner or a loser and that we had this sort of honest broker role. So that was algorithms. That was one aspect that went into the production of this pretty product. Another is time series. So there was actually a series of sensors on a series of different remote sensing platforms, and stitching those together into a consistent time series so we can have this nice long view was a research effort in its own right. So bridging between, if you will, sensor to sensor, satellite platform to satellite platform, stitching that together into a consistent time series. And then there were things like how you grid the data, the projections you put it into, and so forth. And it's interesting, a few years ago, the data center tried to do a comprehensive full reprocessing of the whole data set and create the benchmark. This is the one. This is the consistent time series using the best algorithms. And it was interesting. They could not fully reproduce the data because there were human decisions made along the way that were not well documented, that got captured in those algorithms in those time series. So it's just highlighting. So I think that the data are good, but there's certain uncertainties there that we need to think about. The last point I want to make is context. How do we understand these data? So this is just a pretty picture, and it seems very clear-cut that the edge of the ice is right here. But actually, different communities define ice edge in different ways. So the algorithms that were used to define this edge were used from a climatological perspective. So good for a long time series, trend analysis, that sort of thing. If you are an operational shipper trying to navigate a ship through the Arctic, you define edge in a very different way that this data would not necessarily help you with. If you are a hunter that's using the ice as a platform to hunt whales or seals, you define ice in a very different way, ice edge in a very different way. So all that different context is necessary to be able to interpret these data. So algorithms, time series, projections, grids, context, all of this, and so the context is particularly how you relate this to a particular audience. So I mentioned that starting in 2007 and then in 2012, we got a lot of public attention on this. So the press needed a way to better understand this. So this is another way that we developed to present the data. So this is an online chart that you can play with, and you can put different years up. So what I've got here, and you can't see it very well. So this is the long-term mean. This is this is the annual cycle from January to December. Sea ice grows and shrinks every year, reaches a minimum typically in late September. And you can't see it here, but this is a range of 2 standard deviations. So you can see that 2012 was radically lower. It's maybe 3-4 standard deviations below the long-term mean. And the thing to remember about this long-term mean, this is a 30-year mean in a period, not a steady state period, in a period of decline. So this is, it just highlights how radical things work. But the point is just another way of presenting the data, and for a different audience, a different context. The blue line is this year, 2015. So I just grabbed this figure a couple of days ago off the web. But this is actually the data. So that pretty picture, that pretty graph that boils it down, it's actually much more complex than that. So, and this just gives you a hint of the complexity and the various algorithms that go into it. Some of the data is processed in near real time. Some of it is integrated with other products that requires a lot of explanation to the user. And I'll just sort of go through what all these different things is. So sea ice is a very important parameter if you're trying to understand Arctic change. It's a very complex parameter. Can't find my mouse. There we go. And so we need to integrate data across sort of myriad domains to address these various problems. So just to give you a sense, I'm not going to go through this whole figure and explain it all, but just to give you a sense, the brown squares, these guys, try this, these guys, are data sources. The green hexagons are data products, so that's something that's produced from the data sources. The blue ovals are near real-time products that are produced within 24 hours of receipt from the sensor. The red octagons, a few of them like this and this, are interpretive products, things like climatologies, things like that, graphs. And then the yellow or brownish rounded rectangles are temporary products that are preliminary products that eventually go away. And so that figure, so all of this goes into producing, I don't know if you can see there's sort of a gray outline around these. That's what led to that figure that I showed you. So this is a long introduction highlighting one product, but the point is to illustrate that there are all these relationships between products, between algorithms, and even politics, the politics of science that I mentioned, that are necessary to make a data set actually usable and interpretable and reusable. And so, in a sense, what we're trying to do, in my mind, is increase the generative value of data. I think this is a really interesting concept, the generative value of data. And it comes from Jonathan Zittrain. It comes from John Wilbanks, who builds from Jonathan Zittrain. Zittrain was originally talking about the generative value of open networks, particularly the internet. And John Wilbanks extends that then to data. And they define it as the capacity to produce unanticipated change through unfiltered contributions from broad and varied audiences. In other words, sort of lay it out there and let people have at it and see what happens. And Wilbanks then argues that data become more generative by being more adaptable, so being able to adapt to different circumstances, different applications, more easily mastered, how easy it is to understand the data, use it, and apply it in your context. More accessible, can you get to it? And then more connected or linked with other data, it's sort of influence, if you will. This is a tougher concept to get around. But he argues that what we're thinking about is not net present value in the classic economic sense, but net potential value. How can this be used over time? And I think sometimes this is actually somewhat antithetical to current data practice to try and increase this generative value. So Wilbanks lays it out in sort of a four-dimensional space, if you will, and we're trying to maximize that space. So these are these four dimensions that I mentioned. Adaptability, how well you can adapt it to multiple uses. Ease of mastery, how easy it is to use. How accessible it is, and then how interconnected it is. He calls it leverage, so how interconnected, how influential it is. And you can see how sometimes these things may be in opposition. That figure that I showed of the images of sea ice, very easy to master. I mean, you don't need to be an expert in sea ice to look at that. But it's not very adaptable. It's really just a pretty picture. You can't do really good analysis with that. So there's sometimes a tension in these. And this is, I think, sometimes with curation, we're trying to make it all perfect before we make it open. And I think it's better if we just let it out and see what unanticipated change might occur. Using that sea ice example, for years, polar bear researchers would come to the data center and say, we need data about sea ice. You may have heard that as sea ice is receding, it's impacting polar bear habitat, their hunting patterns, their livelihood, et cetera. And there's risk of polar bears going extinct. The sea ice experts said, do not use this data. Too uncertain. The edges are not good for your application. Don't use this data. I was at the last American Geophysical Union meeting about a year ago, and I think I saw about 4 posters from polar bear researchers using this data. My point is that the people that created the data are not necessarily the best people to advise on the reuse of the data. This is that unanticipated change aspect. And so the sea ice researchers are correct to be highlighting the uncertainties and emphasizing the uncertainties, but it's up to that polar bear researcher to decide how to interpret that uncertainty and use it in their application. They're the expert in their domain. So it's not always this is not intuitive, that it's not always best to ask the expert who produced the data the best way to reuse the data. So in general, I'm thinking that to make open data work, we need several things. And this is not everything. This is just some of the things. We need this curation, making the data better, increasing the value of the data, increasing that generative value of the data. Context. We need to put the data in context that makes it useful to the myriad people that want to use it. Trust is central. And I'm going to come back to the issue of trust. Trust is a big issue. But trust in the data, trust in the organizations behind it, trust in the data center as this honored broker that I mentioned. But then through all of this, and I mentioned this I think a time or two already, is that there's these interconnections, interfaces, connections, relationships. It's sort of a mediation aspect, if you will. The data center was acting as a mediator between the original producer and the multiple users on the end. And so these are bridges, if you will. And I'll come back to that metaphor, bridges, because I think it's an important metaphor. And, of course, people. And that implies training in data science, training in data use, but also understanding the needs of the people. So that's a long description of one data set of one parameter in one discipline, and all that went into making that more useful for a broad audience. So the Research Data Alliance wants to do that for all data in all disciplines. So simply put, I like our vision. Our vision is researchers and innovators openly sharing data across technologies, disciplines, cultures, nations to address the grand challenges of society. And we do this by building these social and technical bridges that enable the open sharing of data. And this is an important metaphor, social and technical bridges. And part of why it's important is because of that interconnection I talked about, and I'll talk more about that. But also, bridge building evokes infrastructure. It makes us think about infrastructure. And that's essentially what we're trying to do, is build a data infrastructure. But then that always begs the question, what is infrastructure? It's hard to understand what is infrastructure. All we really know is that we have something that looks like this, and we want something that looks like this. Or at least we want something that looks like that in the United States. That'll fortunately work here in Japan, but if we're in Europe, they want something that looks like this. So we use things like this. And this is not just whimsical. This is actually the way infrastructure works, is through these connections. And there's actually a field of study called infrastructure studies that has looked at how infrastructure has been created in the past. And if you were to read one report on infrastructure, excuse me, infrastructure studies, I'd highly recommend this one. It's a nice short report, tight executive summary. And what they did is they did a survey of past infrastructures, everything from railroads to the banking system to the internet. And the first observation is maybe kind of obvious, but I think it's central and important, is that infrastructures become ubiquitous, accessible, reliable, and transparent as they mature. Transparent in that we don't notice them until they're broken. You don't notice electricity until the lights go out. You just sort of take it for granted. And that's what good infrastructure is. It becomes so part of your daily life, it becomes invisible. And then so as such, it's hard to study. How do you study something that's transparent? But through this analysis of past infrastructures, they find that infrastructure is never built from the top down. There is never a central plan that is built out to. I mean, it may start with a central plan, but it never goes according to plan. And instead, infrastructure follows this evolutionary process, where it starts with a systems building phase, where people are developing specific technologies to address particular problems in particular contexts. And then there's a sort of a networking phase or a tech transfer phase, where these tools, these systems are used in different contexts, in different places, and sometimes competing systems emerge. The classic example is within electricity, the AC versus DC debate, Tesla versus Edison. But then finally there's this consolidation phase that bridges across these networks to create internetworks. And this consolidation phase is characterized by gateways, or you might call them bridges. These things that allow dissimilar systems to link together. So those plug adapters is a literal example. That is something that we take for granted. So I can use my laptop in any hotel room in the world. And that is a fundamental part of infrastructure. So it's really not a question of what is infrastructure, but when is infrastructure. When are we at that consolidation phase marked by those bridges and gateways? And I would argue that in the data world, I think that we are coming into that period of time now, that now is that consolidation phase. But of course, it's not just a question of when is infrastructure, but who is infrastructure. Because as Edwards et al. Point out, is that we think of these gateways, these bridges, as either technical solutions or social solutions, because they're addressing either technical problems or social problems. But in actuality, it's usually some sort of combination. It's never an either or. It's often a technical solution coupled with a social choice. It's all well and good to develop a standard, but you have to choose to use that standard, and you have to choose to use that standard in a consistent way. And so what we find is you can't, if we want this to work, we can't specify exactly how the work is to be done. You can provide these tools, but people have to then make the choice to apply them in their context. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But the point is that it's somewhat of a false dichotomy, thinking of technical and social, that they need to bridge together. So in my mind, when I think about infrastructure, I define infrastructure as a body of relationships, interactions, connections between people, technologies, institutions, organizations, what have you. All those things that go into making a data set reusable and useful in many different contexts. And so this is what RDA focuses on, is building those social and technical bridges, those gateways, those interconnections. So we have this theme, or this mantra, if you will, of create, adopt, use. We have short-term working groups. They only exist for 12 to 18 months, at the end of which they have actually implemented something. They don't just develop a recommendation or a white paper. They've actually put something into practice. So it might be adopted policy. Not just the policy itself, but actually putting it in practice. What does that mean? Systems interoperability, interoperability components. So, and these pictures, these are not meant to be literal. These are sort of metaphors of the sorts of things that we're thinking about. This slide is courtesy of Fran Berman. Common types, standards, metadata. Sustainable economics, something that we don't think about, I don't think enough in terms of in this context, is how do we sustain these systems over time in a community-supported way. So I thought this notion of public transport, I thought, was an interesting metaphor for that. Adopted community practice, and I really like Fran's metaphor here of rules of the road. So I travel all over the world, and with the exception of this driving on the left, driving on the right thing, most places have similar traffic laws. But it's a radically different experience to drive in Paris or Tokyo or Beijing or New York, because there's these sort of community norms that everybody just sort of knows as to how the rules of the road really work. And so that's part of it as well, is those sort of norms approach. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the people, training them, educating them. And so these are the sort of things that we produce, and I'll go into more details. And since we have no top-down plan, and we just say to the community, come together in short-term working groups and build bridges, we do provide a little bit of unity. And so we ask that people adhere to certain common principles. So this is our sort of what binds us together. We're 1,000 flowers blooming, producing all these different deliverables, but we all agree to these principles. Openness, and so that doesn't just mean open data, that means open in our processes, open to broad participation, etc. Consensus-based decision-making, a balanced approach, not favoring any one particular technology over another. And similarly, a approach towards harmonization, trying to bring things together. And then we're community-driven and nonprofit. So what are some of these little bridges that we develop? So again, using another metaphor of the data engine. This again comes from Fran. And so she talks about the technical parts of the data engine. So we have, for example, and I'll go into some more details in a little bit, but a reference model for how do you type data, a data type registry. So you might think of this as like MIME types for data. MIME types are those things that tells your email that attachment is a Word file or something like that. So when you click on it, it automatically opens up Word and does it. So wouldn't that be cool if research data was typed like that? That your tools knew, oh, this is a hydrograph, and in this column is the flow rate, and it's in these units, and that sort of thing. So this is something more domain specific to a particular discipline, is an interoperability framework using a semantic approach for wheat data. This is information about wheat, its harvest levels, its moisture content, things like that. And then I mentioned these rules of the road. How do we approach things? And I think I'll talk about data citation in a minute and data repositories, but legal interoperability is a big issue that comes up a lot. And so this is not one of our working groups. This is a longer-term group, an interest group. But they're developing these common principles that are going to hopefully work across many jurisdictions. If you're involved at all with licensing around data and copyright issues around data, it's extremely complex, way more complex than it should be in my mind, because of different jurisdictional approaches in different countries. And so this is trying to put some harmonization across that. And then the better drivers. You have your data engine. You got to operate the things. So we have a summer school program that we're working in conjunction with CoData to develop a data science curriculum, particularly in the developing world. And this is one of my favorites: active data management plans. A number of countries are starting to require data management plans with proposals. The National Science Foundation in the U.S. has required this for several years. Other countries are starting to do this as well. The thing about data management plans is things never go according to plan. Research never goes according to plan. So you need to, as I like to quote Dwight Eisenhower, who says that plans are worthless, but planning is essential. So it needs to be an ongoing, dynamic process, is the point. So that's just, I think, an interesting one. So I actually want to spend a little time now going through the specific products that have come out of RDA. And this is going to probably be a little esoteric. But the point is that we're an organization that's only 2.5 years old, and we actually have real deliverables. So this is the first 4 that we formally endorsed. I should note that the endorsement implies, well, endorsement comes from a measure of consensus. If we see that there's community consensus around this, then our council says, okay, this is an endorsed product. And unlike standards bodies like ISO, which have a very rigorous definition of consensus, basically the ISO definition is no sustained opposition. Our definition is it adopted? Is it being used? Is somebody using this? Or is organizations using it? That, to us, is a measure of consensus. So we're not looking at perfect adoption, but we are making sure that someone is using it. So started out with just a simple foundational terminology. And it's maybe a way to think about it maybe is as a very basic data model. So very simple terms like what's a digital object? What's a persistent identifier? Just so we had a consistent way of talking about things. I'm sure this will be an ongoing debated topic. I mentioned the data type registry, this sort of MIME types for data. That seems to be getting picked up in a lot of different places. I think a point to mention with that is it's a federated type system. There's not going to be one registry for all data types. You put a registry in place for your application, your domain, but they all follow a similar model, so hopefully there's some interoperability between them. Very similarly is a persistent identifier type registry. What type of thing is being identified in a persistent identifier? Is it an article? Is it a data set? Is it a person? And then a basic set of machine actionable rules. They call them practical policies, but it's not policy in the sort of political sense. It's a machine actionable rule. So very basic things like a fixity check or to copy something or to back up something. So it's a trust issue. So if repositories are using these consistent actionable rules, it implies a level of trust. So these are kind of small, esoteric, technical little things. As we go forward, we're starting to see some broader bridges, if you will. So a metadata standards directory. These have been released just in our last plenary last month, and they're going through the formal sort of endorsement process now. You hear the old saw, the wonderful thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And so this is a way to help choose, that there's so many metadata standards. It's meant, for example, a library that's beginning to take on research data management. And they're taking on research data from many different disciplines. And they need to make choices about metadata. This is a way that would help with that choice. A dynamic data citation methodology. I think it's fair to say that we know how to cite data at the collection level. We don't necessarily do it, but we know how to do it. What's very difficult is to cite a particular subset of a dynamically changing data set that goes through many versions consistently added to. Think of, if I wanted to reference a specific subset of that sea ice data set at a particular time, how do I do that? And so this is an approach to trying to do that. I mentioned the wheat data. So this is actually quite exciting because it's actually being picked up by the Food and Agricultural Organization. It's being used broadly around the world. And you can see it as something fundamentally important, something that's related to feeding the 7 billion of us crawling all over the planet. This is an interesting one, this data discovery reference, I forget what it stands for. Anyway, it's a service for interconnecting registries. There's so many data registries, but through common keys, if you will, or persistent identifiers, maybe a grant ID or an author, that you can start to interconnect these different registries. The next suite of products coming out is first a unified repository certification scheme. Publishers, funders, others are looking for a way that they can say this is indeed a trusted repository. And there's multiple standards out there for how you certify a repository. So this is an effort to bring the World Data System and the Data Seal of Approval and to harmonize their standards into a consistent standard. And then there's a series of data publishing related services. So data publishing is a sort of a buzz right now, that making data available in a way that you might think of making an article available and having a close interconnection between the article and the data. But then how do we measure the impact of that? Bibliometrics is not the right word, data-o-metrics or something. What's an impact factor for data? And recognizing that the impact factor is a very flawed measure in the first place. How do we manage these workflows in a way that data are connected with the article and interconnecting those articles and that data? So this also relates to that previous system I mentioned of the registries and how they interconnect. So I just wanted to give you a sort of a high-level overview of what has been produced by RDA now. And I realize, it's kind of esoteric, and if you want to get into more detail, please talk to me. Please go to our website. But the other thing I wanted to get at here is that we're 2.5 years old. We have these initial products, but there's a lot more going on as well, and it seems to have attracted a lot of attention. This slide is already out of date. I think we're over 3,500 members now. So we've grown really rapidly. We have members from many different countries, although we're primarily oriented to the North Atlantic right now. That's something that we want to change. That's partly why I'm here in Japan. And so this isn't just a European, North American initiative. Mostly academics, but we are growing in the private sector, the government sector. That's another area that we want to focus on. But clearly there's a growth and there's an interest. And there's 56 different groups that have come together. So I was going to list them all, but it would just be confusing. And then also in addition to individual members, we have organizational members. Unlike individuals join for free. I encourage you all to join. Organizations actually pay a modest membership fee because we want them to have some skin in the game. And we actually want them to have a stronger voice, if you will, within RDA because we focus on implementation and adoption. And we recognize that it's organizations that adopt, not individuals. It's all well and good if an individual researcher adopts something in their lab, but to really have an impact, organizations have to pick it up. That's how these things grow. So we want to hear from organizations, from their organizational perspective, what is it that they need and what is it they are going to implement. This is also out of date. I think there's probably another 4 or 5 organizations that have joined since then. It's a diverse group, publishers, supercomputing centers, libraries, tech consortia, research institutes, but not very many from, in fact, I don't think any on this slide from the private sector, although we have picked up a couple private sector members recently. So that's something that I think we really need to extend into is better connections with the private sector. So we have these 56 groups, we have these 3,500 members, all these different things going on, and it's a little chaotic. It's sort of hard to get your hands around. But I think some themes are beginning to emerge across this diversity, across this difference. And the first is this simple concept of persistent identifiers, being able to consistently unambiguously, over time, reference a particular thing, and not just data sets, not just articles, but people, institutions, processes, instruments. Of all those 56 groups, I think this is something that you see across all of them, that they all have sort of taken it as a given that if we're going to have an interoperable data infrastructure, we have to persistently reference what we're talking about. And a colleague of mine, Peter Wittenberg, pulls this slide from how the internet was created, and this notion of the internet protocol as sort of the thin waist that connects all the network technologies to all the value-added services, and that there's this sort of that so much relies on that simple internet protocol. So you might think of that as a similar sort of thing with a data network, where persistent identifiers are that thin waist that connects all those data sources, digital objects, data sets, databases, et cetera, through to value-added services such as applications, analysis platforms, et cetera. So this is, I think, an important concept, this persistent identifier concept. The second theme is this notion of certifying trust. How do we say that we trust something? You know, I mentioned the trusted repositories. Okay, so there's a certification scheme for that. Do we always need to certify trust? Can we rely on the wisdom of the crowd? This notion of data publishing implies data peer review. But I think that's completely misguided, because data is not reviewed. Data are measurements or facts. They are not reviewed in the same way as an argument in an article. It's sort of it's a different way of approaching things. So how do we trust those data? The polar bear researcher decided that they trusted the data even though the expert said that they shouldn't. You know, so this notion of how do we certify trust, I think, is a difficult question. And then I've harped on this theme repeatedly, the value of conversations, relationships, interconnections, and mediation. I think mediation is really central to what we do. And this is a nice slide. I'm not going to go through it in detail. It comes from Chris Borgman, and she just talks about how mediation has gotten increasingly complex over time. That, you know, in the old days, things were culturally mediated. Communication was simply face-to-face. You know, we're very familiar with communication-mediation through television, telephones, et cetera. We're now used to internets and databases as a mediating layer in this. And now in this modern world, it just gets more and more complex. But this intelligence of crowds, but it's also the intelligence of the curator, the mediator themselves. There is a role for these in-between people. And I think that's central to what RDA is focused on, is that mediation concept. And part of this is actually related, and because what we want to do as an organization is be flexible and recognize that things are going to change. So a colleague of mine repurposed the Agile Manifesto for software. So if you know anything about software development, Agile development is all the rage these days. And they have this manifesto. And so this is a colleague of mine repurposed this in thinking about how organizations might work. And the idea is that we value the stuff on the left more than the stuff on the right. The stuff on the right is important, but we put emphasis on the stuff on the left. So we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, the people over the technology. We value working volunteers over comprehensive documentation. It's more important to engage the community than to detail everything that's being done. We value collaboration over contract negotiation. Let's just get down to work. Let's not spend all of our time negotiating. We value responding to change over following a plan. Again, you know, plans are worthless, but planning is essential. So the other, okay, I'll talk briefly about this. Another way that we're thinking, so those three themes were one way of sort of bringing this together, and I'll come back to those. But some other ways of thinking about how all this diversity, all these different working groups come together, is this sort of clustering approach. So we have a group called the Technical Advisory Board that are supposed to help guide us in our sort of socio-technical vision for the RDA. And what they've done is they've laid out a space of two dimensions, with the beneficiary dimension stretching from things that are useful to data providers to things that are useful to data consumers. And then the solutions definition from technical solutions to social solutions. And as I mentioned, usually it's somewhere in between. And so our different working groups, these are the working groups that we have, start to form into clusters. And this is maybe just a way to begin to get some handle on all the diversity. That, okay, the wheat data interoperability group is focused on users of the data, and it's largely a technical solution. It's a semantic approach. So that's just one example. It's a way to sort of get your hand around all the different things that are going on. Another way to get a hand of all the things that are going on is this concept of a data fabric. And I think this is interesting because this actually came from a German colleague, and Fabrik in German means factory. So he was talking about data fabric, and he was thinking sort of this production idea. And everybody else was hearing fabric and thinking this sort of interweaving of things. So it's sort of a double entendre, a double meaning, both manufacturing and interwoven. But the basic idea is this is just a very simplistic model of how data production might work. Basically that raw data is produced, it is registered. So this is the central thing. It means that it has a persistent identifier put on it and a little bit of metadata. That's the central piece right there, is that it's registered. It's put in a permanent store, and then somebody wants to use it. Typically they pull out a collection. Maybe they run it through some sort of processing of their own, which results in another collection, which in turn gets registered again. And it's this permanent store that is then referenced by publications. So this is just a very simple, inaccurate, really, view of a data production process. But it shows how some of those original deliverables and those original working groups interconnect here into different places. So this persistent identifier types, it's part of the processing step. It's part of the registration step, as I mentioned. The practical policy, that's going to be part of the processing step. This foundational terminology is all throughout here because this is sort of that simple data model. So it's just a way to start thinking about how the pieces interconnect. And what's been interesting to me is, so we're about 2.5 years old, and the community has found these interconnections on their own. This is, again, there's no top-down plan. This came from 4 different interest groups, working on independently, and then they realized, hey, we have an interconnection here. And so they've now formed another group, this data fabric group, that's starting to stitch the pieces together. So my point is it's actually working, that these little bridges are starting to bridge to each other. And then I didn't mean to include all this, but Peter shows how all sorts of different groups can hang off this thing. This is data management plans, repository certification, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can start to, I won't go through these. I'm not sure I could. But just to give you a point that this is one way of thinking about the overall data enterprise. All right, so at this point, I actually want to reel it back in a little bit, take another step back, and think about, what is it that that's making this work? Why are 3,500 people coming together into RDA in a short period? What's the enthusiasm around this? And what do we mean by data sharing? It implies so much, from preservation to access to reuse to documentation to protocols. So I've just been thinking, inspired by this very simple diagram, I've been thinking about data management in a very basic way. And before coming to RDA, I managed data for a long time. And one of the really cool things about this job is that I get to see how a lot of other disciplines manage their data and even conceive of their data. Different disciplines conceive of data in very different ways. What is data for one group is not data for another, and vice versa. So it's kind of fascinating. And so I've been thinking about how data work. And there's some really basic principles or commonalities. And these aren't new, but I think they're worth repeating, and I think they inform this development of infrastructure. So step 1, save the data. And this is a picture from a field campaign that I was involved with a decade ago or so. Big field campaign, airborne sensors, models, in situ measurements. Big field campaign of 50 people going out into the mountains to measure the snow. So, but even during a ski crash, he's preserved the data. That's his field notebook there, And my point with that is that at that point of collection, that preservation ethos is very strong. The researcher understands they got to save that data. Another example, I was involved with another field campaign, and one guy, his little logger, he was measuring snow depth, his data logger conked out halfway through. He got up very early the next morning to go out and remeasure measure that course again, because that data was so valuable. In the field, that preservation ethos is really strong. And then it fades. And then, so it's after that initial use, the preservation ethos fades. And so how do we maintain that, I think, is a central issue. And with preservation, I think it's hard, but we know what to do. It's just a question of how to sustain it. So in a sense, we've kind of solved this problem. We just haven't figured out the business model. So, all right, save the data. That's hard. And there's a strong research ethos behind that. Step 2, share the data. And I love this picture because I love this sort of expression on the little girl's face. She's a little uncertain, maybe a little reluctant. And my point here is we don't have the culture. We don't have a culture of sharing, or it varies widely from discipline to discipline as to how. And I think it's important to remember that preservation and access are separate but interdependent concerns. Two sides to the same coin, maybe sort of a yin and yang thing. I like to say that preservation without access is pointless. Access without preservation is impossible. That said, sharing, we don't know how to do it. And so that's where the RDA approach is just have at it. Follow those basic principles I mentioned, openness, harmonization, balance, consensus. But just we don't know how to do this. So we're taking this Thousand Flowers bottoms-up approach, and I think some people question that. They want a plan. But I believe in it quite strongly, and I think it's working. And so these little bridges are coming out, and they're starting to come together. And so I mentioned these themes that I've seen across all this diversity, but I think there's a bigger theme that reaches across all of them, and it is trust. It's not just that certification of trust, but it's trust writ large. And I would like to read a quote from Mark Bide, who was talking about at the 20th anniversary of the Digital Object Identifier, one of the leading persistent identifiers. And he says, if the barriers to achieving universality of identity management, identifying things, if the barriers are not primarily technical, if the same identifier system can be equally used to identify scholarly journal articles and Hollywood movies, where do they lie? Where do those difficult barriers lie? It is often assumed by those on the outside of the standards world that standards are simply about technologies. The best technical solution will always win. In reality, what those of us who have worked in standards know, one of our guilty secrets, is that standards implementation is mostly about establishing acceptable social norms to which people willingly adhere. How does that come about? The answer is primarily encapsulated in a single word, a single concept: trust. He then goes on to say, while we talk about neutrality in the standards world, there is another hidden and often unacknowledged secret in standards making. No standard can ever be wholly neutral. Every standard has an unspoken point of view, a perspective, a set of assumptions that informs its entire specification. But it's important also that the specification represents a consensus point of view among those who implement it. And so, just as he's talking in standards and identification, I think trust is central to data sharing. And because data sharing is often where that friction occurs, where the difference occurs. And so it's where trust is prominent and essential, and how we maintain that consensus point of view around implementation. So I've been thinking about this, and I just have some amateur thoughts on how we can build trust. I'm beginning to wrap up here. I touched on this before. When or do we need to certify trust? How do we certify that this is trustworthy? Do we rely on the wisdom of the crowd? Do we rely on the wisdom of experts? Do we rely on simple reuse? If a data set is reused, does that make it trustworthy? I think those are open questions. I think we need to preserve the freedom to tinker, the freedom to play with things. This is similar to the open source movement, is that to share means you need to allow people to play with what you make available. So that's a trust issue, to release something and allow people to play with it and manipulate it. That's difficult. And we need to build in decentralization. This is, again, I think, follows the open source model, that there's not going to be a central system that manages all of this. And any centralization that does occur needs to be community governed. It's not going to be done by the government. It's not going to be done by some sort of authority. The community itself has to buy into that. And again, that's building that trust issue. And so I would argue that trust is built through shared experience, that we learn from each other. And so RDA is one way to share experience. We have plenary meetings every 6 months that brings the community together, and that's where I think people start to learn. Shared perspectives, that point from Bide again, that every standard embodies a perspective. And so RDA then is a forum for engagement and constructive disagreement, to engage with those people that you disagree with. And then I think the other thing that demonstrates trust is actual reuse. So reuse of the data, reuse of the tool. And so that's, again, RDA's focus on, is it being used? That's good enough for us. That implies a level of trust by some people. And then sustainability. Is it continually used? Is it perform over time? And again, so RDA is trying to build that broader coalition, trying to make this an international effort to try and bring people together around things. So we need to bring open data into this. Sorry, never mind. Got too many thoughts going in my head. Okay, I think I'll stop there with this concept of trust. But that I think this community effort and these relationships building is what helps us build trust. And then on this last point of international support, just getting into a few more details on how RDA works, we also have, we're a global organization, an international organization, but there's this concept of regional RDAs. And the idea is that these issues of data sharing, you need to work at them at both a local level and a global level. I like the term glocal. And it's not just think global and act local. It's simultaneously play in both spaces at the same time. So if we were thinking, for example, of an RDA Japan, Japan has its own particular policies, its own particular priorities, building around this open science movement, for example. And so it's a forum then that works within Japan, but then it's something that you could echo up to the international level and bring it back down to the local level. And so we've seen this in several countries. Partly this is just an artifact of how the funding works. People like to spend money, funding agencies like to spend money in their own countries. But it's actually turned out to be a useful way to operate. Finally, in conclusion, I think RDA is actually making an impact. We're having an influence. First of all, data are having their day. The term big data is a buzzword. It's not necessarily a buzzword I'm fond of, but I'm glad it's out there. Some of us have been talking about the need to think about data for decades, and now it's actually being heard. And I think RDA is both a result of that, but also an amplifier of that. It's raising that message even more. I've mentioned the value of collaboration, and I think that's the one thing I've heard from the community time and time again, is that most of the thing that they're getting out of RDA is that simple value of collaboration. It's accelerating harmonization, for example. I said that we know how to cite data, but I think that's actually a recent thing. I think if we look at how data citation has evolved, there was actually some competing approaches, and I think there was actually sort of some tension there. Different groups were going to be, okay, we're going to be the group that solves this problem first. But all those groups happened to just come together at the first RDA plenary and realize, hey, let's work together. And so they developed some common principles of data citation. So it's a joint declaration from many different organizations on data citation principles. They're just principles. They're just high-level motherhood statements. But it got everybody together, and now we can start working on some of the more difficult issues of how do we actually get researchers to cite the data? And we know how do we actually get the practice? How do we do that dynamic citation? To me, it was a major step forward, and it was simply by bringing the community together. We're discovering shared themes across different things. I mentioned that persistent identifiers are everywhere. Nobody anticipated that, but it just sort of bubbled up in coming from all sorts of different disciplines, all sorts of different perspectives. People realized, oh, this is a common theme that we can all grab onto. Also, just through happenstance, a friend of mine likes to tell a story of he was demonstrating the data type registry, and an oceanographer was talking about cruises. And it was important for them to note a cruise, a ship excursion. And this atmospheric scientist is like, hey, we have things like that too, platforms that we make measurements on. And when they left, they were having this wonderful discussion of, oh, we have the same issue, and how can we work it in a common way? Just a simple little thing like that people intersect in ways that you wouldn't anticipate. And so I think we're also getting new insight from rethinking some old paradigms. This concept of no architecture for RDA, I think, is radical. And the fact that people have generally accepted that, I think, is actually a remarkable step forward. Another point of impact is that, like I said, we have real deliverables, not just white papers, not just recommendations, in 2 years. And so it's this learn fast through quick failure. That 18-month timeline forces people to focus what they're delivering on and actually get something done and see if it works. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, not that much lost. We can try again. And then demonstrating that we can actually deliver. And as I mentioned also, that we're beginning to see bridges between the bridges, that interconnection is just growing organically. And then finally, I think we're actually saving money. And that I've heard from a number of people is simply by coming to RDA and the connections that they have built, they have built new opportunities to get grants funded. One person told me that simply through coming to RDA and the relationships she built there, she got 3 research grants funded. Now, granted, at least one of them was from the Horizon 2020 project in Europe, which explicitly mentions RDA, but 2 were not. And she attributes that to the connections that she built. Another example that I like to cite comes from colleague Jamie Shears, who was charged with preserving all the data from the Large Hadron Collider. So 100 petabytes of data and growing. And the way he puts it is in the way of Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, a la Caesar. So he came to the RDA plenaries and the various working group and interest group meetings. He saw how other disciplines had attacked this problem, and he learned and developed and refined and is now actually implementing a strategy, including a cost model, for preservation of these data. He estimates that this saved him 3 years of time and about 20 FTE. Now, it's not like those 20 FTE were laid off or something, but they were being reapplied in different things. So that's real and tangible money. Even if he's off by an order of magnitude, that's a significant gain. So I think RDA is making an impact. So going forward, we want to continue to develop this pipeline of infrastructure, continue to push out those little bridges. We want to increase the collaboration across the community. We want to reach out to new domains. I think it's sort of a given that the pure researchers, not very many of them are going to come to RDA, so it's important that RDA people, those people in the middle, reach out to those researchers and engage those communities. That relates again to the outreach and how we engage with educating the workforce, engaging the funding agencies, et cetera. So this is sort of where we're going in the future. And as I mentioned, we meet every 6 months in plenaries at different places around the world. And the next one, I'm happy to say, is here in Tokyo at the beginning of March, so I encourage you all to come. The one after that will be in the United States in a larger effort called International Data Week. So I think I will stop there and be happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. So それでは、
Then at this moment, since we do have plenty of time, so we'd like to open this for Q&A. You can either ask questions in English or Japanese, so please don't hesitate to ask any questions or make any comments. Anyone?
Hi.
Yes, please wait until microphone is. Please use the microphone.
I'm Junior Leblay from AIST. I work in web data management, and so I find this initiative really interesting. But it reminds me a lot of the semantic web. I think it has some similar components, and also in the way you guys work. But I was wondering, so first, how you compare your initiative to that of the semantic web? And a sub-question would be, how do you go about all the problems that emerged from the semantic web? Like, you have these unique identifiers for things, but then because it's all a grassroots thing, people start making different identifiers for similar things, and then you have data integration problems to deal with. That can be a technical issue in many cases. So.
Right. So first of all, in connection to the semantic web, to me, the semantic web is a technology. It's a technical approach. Linked open data, the three basic rules from Tim Berners-Lee. So it's one approach to interoperability, and you see it in parts of RDA. For example, the wheat data is very much following the linked open data approach. There's a new group that's looking specifically at vocabularies. But I think your bigger question is, you can have this sort of overarching approach, but then there's a bunch of different approaches, and sometimes they're incompatible, and how do we start to stitch them together? And this is this organic approach. To me, it's a survival of the fittest sort of thing. That's why we're not saying that we have the solution. We're asking the community, what are your solutions? And it's completely acceptable to have 2, 3, or even 4 competing solutions be developed. And in that organic sort of evolutionary approach, it's the one that survives is the one that's most adaptable to change in the Darwinian sense. And that's what we hope that people start to gravitate towards, and that's why we have that focus on organizational adoption. If organizations are using it, it shows some level of acceptance. But we just don't feel that, I certainly don't feel, that we can say, oh, we have these 2 competing systems, use this one. Or, all right, 2 competing systems, you guys need to figure out a way to interconnect. That's just not the way we operate. We're trying to allow that organic approach, because that's actually the way infrastructure is created. Infrastructure does not get built from the top down. That's why the semantic web will not fully work, because there's not ever going to be one solution for everything. And so it's sort of a philosophical approach, I think. And yeah, maybe the jury's still out as to how well it'll work, but I think we're going in the right direction. Not to say that that's not without risk. There's certainly risk in the approach.
Okay.
Next, any other questions? Yes. Please wait until your microphone is brought to you.
RD output, the output should be shown within 12 to 18 months later after the formation of the groups. And do you have any evaluation scheme, how the delivery or output are okay or not?
Yeah, that's actually something that we're struggling with. And it actually relates to the last question. How do you sort of sustain an output after it's produced? So in terms of evaluation, we're as to, like I mentioned with endorsement, we're cautious on the technical endorsement. We're not saying one is technically better than the other. We're just saying it's being used, so therefore it's useful to somebody, so that's where the endorsement comes from. But how do we sustain that over time? After the end of 18 months, often what's released is a pilot or a beta. How is it updated? Some groups are forming new working groups to create deliverable version 2. Some are forming interest groups, which have a longer timeline and a broader remit as sort of a maintenance group. One of the fundamental issues, and I meant to mention it on the previous question, and that we haven't come up with a solution to, and I'd love to get input on, is that we're always battling the not invented here problem. That I think, and that's, you see that with any technical approach, be it grid computing, the semantic web, GIS systems, it's, everybody feels like, well, that doesn't exactly work in my particular context. I need something special for my particular context. I'm going to use my tool. And so somehow trying to convince the world that sharing in the imperfect is better than the perfect silo. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
So I understand that RDA is going to produce a de facto standard, not a de jure standard. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm very cautious to say that we are not a standards organization. If anything, I think we're on both sides. We're a standards implementation organization. There might be a standard, but the devil is always in the details of how do you actually put it into place. So that might be something that a working group would focus on. How do we take a linked open data standard and apply it to wheat? Then there's also sort of the pre-standards process. Something that might start up and say, oh, this looks like a good idea. Maybe we should then take this to IEEE or to ISO or some formal standards body. So I think we're kind of on both sides there. It's, again, that focus on implementation. And I think getting back to your sustainability question, something that is implemented and adopted is much more likely to be sustained because it has stakeholders that are interested in keeping it alive. How exactly that works, I think, is still kind of an open question.
Okay. So your answer is that so current RDA have no formal organization. So how derivative will be have a feedback or any after evaluation or something?
Oh no, I'm sorry. I should have made that clear. When an output is released, there's a request for comment period. And also when working groups first come together, there's a request for comment period. So actually, if you go to our website right now, there's a new proposed working group, and it's seeking comments from the community. And when they release a product, there's also an RFC period. And then our technical advisory board also formally reviews the outputs. And then we also have an organizational advisory board. That's all those organizations that come together that might weigh in with an opinion on, is this relevant to our organizations? So that's also part, I should have been more clear about that. That's part of that consensus building process. So council, our sort of senior body, they're responsible for the sort of vision and strategy of RDA. Their perspective is they are trying to measure consensus. They are not making a proclamation. They're saying, is there consensus in the community? So they look and see, oh, there's these, the comments, it looks like people think it's okay. Or maybe the comments suggest there's a critical flaw. Oh, it looks like these organizations have picked it up and are actually using it. That suggests that it's adopted. So when they get that sense of consensus, then it gets the, RDA seal of approval or whatever. Then how that's sustained over time is going to vary. I think, like with the wheat guys, I think FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, will pick that up, and that's great. That's no longer RDA's issue then.
Okay. So that's so 12 or 18 months discussion is not so end of discussion yet.
Right. I think, and that's what we're finding. So those first 4 working groups, they should have shut down. They're still kind of limping along, but the 18-month, holding people to a delivery has proven to be really valuable. I originally, when I first started with RDA, was very skeptical about that. That, an international organization producing something in 18 months, but now I kind of have the zeal of the converted. It's like, yes, this can be done. And what it does is it focuses people to make more bite-sized pieces. What can be, and it also, It also, I think, helps with commitment. We're a volunteer organization, and so a volunteer can say, oh, okay, I can commit for a year and a half to get this done. It's not going to be this endless activity. But especially when we start looking at more socially oriented deliverables, 18 months might be a little more constrained. You're not going to change the norms of research in 18 months. So I think it's an ongoing. RDA is adaptive. We may have new approaches and always open to suggestion.
Okay. いかがでしょうか。はい。
Any other questions, views?
Yeah, it's nice to see you in Japan. So today I'm very much happy to hear that RDA is for implementation. I think so many people who has not ever participated in RDA didn't understand what is RDA. And yeah, it is not a standardization body, but yeah, it targets the good practice, best practices, and the good best implementation. And my question is, for instance, dynamic data citation, they have the certain output. However, it is not the final end. It is just a start point to organize the research data. That means metadata registry or repository certification, etc. And so many things are interrelated in a complex way. So do you think or do you have this kind of discussion that multi-layer discussion of the output of working groups producing the next layer of the mixed system or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a direct and clear answer to that, but and this relates to the sustainability. All four questions, I think, were all very interrelated. And different groups are coming together in different ways. So I mentioned that data fabric group. So that's an interest group that came together from 4 working groups, and they wanted to maintain how their 4 products would continue and how their 4 products might actually interrelate. And so that's a discussion forum that's working on. Another one, another group that has just sort of organically come together, well, not entirely organically, is the collaboration with the World Data System. So there's a suite of data publishing outputs, those bibliometrics, the workflows, the interconnection between articles and data. They have an interest group as well, and what they're realizing is that what they want to focus on for the next 6 to 12 months is amplifying adoption, seeing if they can get, they're struggling with that not invented here problem. They want to get all the publishers to recognize that this might be a good approach. So that's going to be their emphasis. And so the groups have come together in their own and are forming their own sort of clusters of activity. And what RDA is trying to do is just foster those connections. So at some plenaries we've required, and this sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, we've required groups to work together, to have joint sessions. We don't say which groups have to work together, but we tried this once where we said, okay, everybody gets 1 session. If you want 2, you have to do it in collaboration with somebody else. That clustering exercise that I showed with the tab, with the 2 dimensions, that's a way we can start to see how there might be groups that come together. So there's a variety of different efforts, both at the sort of governance level of RDA with the Technical Advisory Board, but more at the grassroots level where people are seeing how these interconnections work. So for example, that registry interconnection piece and the data publishing services piece, completely different groups, completely different communities, didn't know anything about each other, but they found each other through RDA, and now there's at least one example of a system that's being developed by OpenAir in Europe that is using both approaches, that has brought those together. So it's really just fostering the connections and hoping the connections are robust rather than telling people to interconnect, creating the opportunity for them to interconnect.
So are you trying to arrange or connecting the multiple working groups to make like that?
A little bit. I mean, that's something that I don't really have anything to show at this point, but we had a student, for example, we have an early career program where we provide some support for early career researchers to participate in RDA. And they started to do sort of a mapping exercise of how they start to interconnect. And that's something that the tab is looking at. But again, these will only be suggestions. Because if you tell people to work together, they won't work together. If you let people work together, they'll work together. You see my point?
Yep, thank you very much.
いかがでしょうか。はい。
Any other questions? The person in the back, please.
Jason Haga from AIST. Good to see you again. I had two questions. One was kind of related to the data publishing. Can you comment on which publishers are actually publishing data, or that are considering accepting data sets and publishing them? And then my second question is more related to the clustering that you did, because I think for some people who are in a particular domain, maybe in biosciences or a particular domain, I'm wondering if they come and look at that, maybe they can't quite figure out what would apply to them. So is there some effort to try and I know you probably are trying to avoid like becoming a service provider, so to speak, with that type of, but is there some way that maybe, people in a certain domain can come and try and figure out, well, what can I use and how do I adopt it?
Right. So on the first question, publishers that are publishing data. So I want to make the distinction between a data publication and a conventional publication that links to data. Data publications, in my mind, this is my personal opinion, are a patch, a way for us to try and give scholarly credit for data. I think it's not a sustainable approach. Publication is a fixed sort of thing. Data is a very dynamic sort of thing. I come from a domain repository. I think domain repositories do a better job of making data available than publishers do. That's my personal opinion. That's not RDA's opinion. But the data publishing group groups are not talking about that kind of data publication. And so, yeah, there's Earth System Science Data. I think that's no, it's not Springer. One of the German publishers, Copernicus. There's Nature has a new data journal. So there's a number of data journals out there. If you're really interested in that, I'm not. Linking the data to the article and vice versa, that to me is a fundamentally different thing. And I think publishers are realizing that they don't want to hold data, that what they would prefer is to have a precise reference to a trusted repository that holds the data. And that they're responsible for the argument, and that there's good evidence behind that argument, and they can link to that evidence. But that's not their responsibility to maintain the evidence. Journals that are doing that include Elsevier, Ubiquity Press, Faculty of 1000, PLOS, and they've, I think all of those have been very active in that publishing data working groups, several of them. Your second question about the domains and the disciplines is a really good one, and it's a focus that we want to have for RDA going forward. And there's a couple things that we're doing in that regard. One, we're putting together sort of an ambassador program. So as I mentioned, I don't think it's realistic that very many pure domain researchers are going to come to RDA. There's the data-oriented ones that are interested in data things that will. But most of them are more interested in their research questions than the particularities of data interoperability. So therefore, it's important, I think, for the people within RDA who are more like those data practitioners, everything from applied computer scientists to librarians, to reach out to their constituencies. When I was a data manager at NSIDC, it was very important for me to build relationships with my research community. That's why I did field work. It gave me credibility. They saw me in the field, ice on my beard, that. So that's one thing, is trying to build those ambassadors to reach out to the domains. But the other is trying to recognize, when things are domain-specific and when things are generic. And one of the things that we're doing to foster these interconnections that Murayama was talking about is that in between plenaries, we have meetings of working group and interest group chairs. And these are partially supported. And the next one will be in the Washington, D.C. area in December. And the theme is actually going to be discipline-specific groups. When does it make sense to be discipline-specific? When does it make sense to be generic? How do you make that distinction? And I think that's a really open question. And I don't think there's any bright line. So I don't have an answer, but I think there's at least discussions going forward that I think will be interesting.
Thank you.
はいかがでしょうか。本当に別に日本語で質問されても構いません。はい、どうぞ。
Any other questions? Of course, you can speak in Japanese.
About the RDA actually, but I'm curious about the status of the persistence identifiers systems. So you guys already published it or a specification about the PID, or still discussing to create the specifications? And I think it's to be represented of some numbers to represent some data, but how can I wonder how to say, it's kind of IP address, the RDA also trying to represent some data to using some kind of the system to like the IP address, or?
Okay, I think I understand your question. And we're getting to the limits of my technical knowledge. And this may relate to the very first question. There are multiple persistent identifier schemes out there, many. And many that can be used for the same type of thing. And honestly, it's almost like religious wars sometimes between the different identifier systems. To date, RDA has tried to be very agnostic about that and not to take a particular side to say that we like the DOI or we like a different flavor of the handle or the life science ID or the UUID or whatever. And the one area where I think that there has been some harmonization come together on this is that persistent identifier type registry. So it's a way of registering your persistent identifiers, again, with a little bit of metadata. And so what we're trying to maybe standardize is the metadata around the identifiers. Rather than the technical system, how the identifier resolves or how it identifies. Instead, we're saying at least give us a little bit of information about how it resolves, what it's pointing to, that sort of thing. And like I said, I'm sort of at the limits of my technical knowledge there. But to date, we're not defining the overarching specification for the perfect persistent identifier. That's not really the way RDA works. If a consistent persistent identifier emerges, that'd be great. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
いかがでしょうか。はい、じゃあ前。
Any further questions? To the front, please. In Japanese, of course, if you want to. Thank you very much. I have a few questions. One on your organization. You're only 2 years and a half, and you have a lot of activity on ideas that are coming out. And the more you're in existence, you become more rigid, and you will be perhaps valuing more on what your outputs were in the past and how you're going to sustain them. How are you going to sustain the momentum that you have? Could you give us a policy of how you're going to sustain the active momentum currently that you have been enjoying?
So let me make sure I understand the question. How do we sustain the momentum? And if we have a policy for that, and then how do we, is it fair to say, manage, keep track of all the different deliverables that come out. Is that a fair reflection of your question? Okay.
Maybe provide because now it's 3 years for you.
Yeah, two and a half, 3
years, and then 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. So it's going on lot of deliverables. So how is then big or some sort of become conservative or what the direction of RDA?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, we're kind of operating on a 10-year plan. We're not assuming that we are going to exist after 10 years. Maybe we will, or maybe we'll be something completely different. Maybe we'll have solved the problem, and we'll all be done. Maybe. So we don't have a super long time horizon because change is so rapid. So we've been going through a future directions planning exercise lately, and that's only been looking out 3 years. And it's been very focused on sort of tactical type decisions. It's how do we make the organization work better? How do we engage with more communities? But that sustainability issue is just, you bump into it everywhere. And I think you make a really good point. And so it's sustaining the outputs, it's sustaining the organization. We've developed a business model that relies on government for sustaining the organization. The argument there is that government produces the majority of research data, and society is what benefits from research data reuse. So government, as a representative society, has an interest in maintaining that. So that's our philosophy, our business model for sustaining the organization. Sustaining the outputs, again, as I mentioned many times, is dependent upon the outputs themselves and the community that's using them. Whether they want to continue to do that through RDA, through our working group process, or whether they get adopted by another organization that maintains them, that's fine. How do we maintain the philosophy, if you will, of staying agile and not becoming rigid, like you said? I think we just have to keep that attitude. I think you're right. I mean, that it's easy to fall into traps of this is the way we always did it. One thing I can tell you that personally, I'm only going to keep this job for a few years. I'm not going to be the Secretary General forever, partly because I don't think I can do the job forever, but more importantly, I don't think it's good for the organization. I think there needs to be, refreshment. And I think, again, that similarly, it's the community. If we have to keep the community enthusiastic. We have to support the volunteers. We have to make anybody feel like their idea is important. That anybody can bring any idea to RDA, and if you have a group of people that you can work with, especially an international group, and get things done, we'll support that. And so a policy, no, but maybe sort of a philosophy that I think it's something that I'm certainly trying to inculcate within the organization. That's that agile piece that I mentioned. Is trying to be adaptive, focusing on the volunteer over the process. It's still early days. I don't know if we'll be successful or not.
Okay.
Anyone else? 最後の質問はですね、締めの質問として本当に良かったと思います。
Really last question.
じゃあ日本語で。
In Japanese. So if you want to participate in RDA, 18-month commitment, if that is necessary, make it difficult for us to decide to join. What's the simplest way to participate in RDA? For example, if it's an ordinary international conference, you might publish a paper and that's it. But in the case of RDA, you have to form a group and you have to commit 18 months, write reports. If that's the requirement, it makes it difficult. Is there a lower entry bar? Because we're going to have that meeting in Tokyo next year. I think some might want to participate, but if that's the bar, I think that may make it difficult for people to participate.
Understand. I think there's different levels of participation. I mean, the first thing is go to a plenary. there's no better way to understand what RDA is about and how it works than to go to a plenary. And so that's a commitment of a few days. And it's a way to explore and see what's going on. You can participate in working groups or interest groups at any level that you see fit. You can just monitor them and see them you can join their email list and see and just monitor it and see if there's interesting things that come out that you're interested in. If something particularly engages you and you want to get heavily involved for only a few months, you want to present a use case, say, for some of these things, or you want to try out one of the outputs to see if it actually will work for you. So you don't have to commit for 18 months. That's if you're passionate about wanting to solve a problem and do it in a working group context. And I think, of those 3,500 members, probably 10, 20% are the real active members that like any organization, and some just watch. But I think the majority sort of come and go. They monitor the activity of maybe half a dozen groups that they're interested in, and when something emerges that they're particularly interested in, they engage in the conversation. But to figure out where you're most interested, that's I think the hardest part. And I can talk to you offline about that, and help you guide you on that. But again, come back here in 5 months and jump in. I mean, I think that's the best way to understand how RDA works.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's time now. So let's close this lecture and Q&A of Mr. Parsons. Thank you.